Hello and greetings, live from all around the world. This is the Atlantic Council, here today to talk about identifying and fixing disruptions to the global food system. We've assembled a very prestigious group of panelists to talk to you about what actions we can all do, whether we're from the public, whether we're from industry, whether we're from government, what we can do to address the fact that there are vulnerabilities to the global food system, some of which are being presented even more prominently now with COVID-19, and what we can do to make sure that we make it more resilient and fix so it can be more shock resistant in the future ahead. With that said, I'm going to turn first to Andrew Mack. Andrew, greetings, welcome, and I'd welcome your thoughts as to what we can do to address disruptions to the global food system.
Well, thanks, David. It's a real pleasure to be here. When you asked the question, I thought probably the biggest challenge that we face around the world right now is the challenge of visibility. Most of the farmers around the world are small farmers. We're talking about 500 million small farms, most of which are completely invisible to markets. They're not plugged into the global supply chain. Their products can't be seen by the outside world, and they can't see the outside world. And as a result, they have tremendous trouble connecting with markets. They have tremendous trouble getting value for the products that they produce. And so visibility for me is the number one thing. It keeps our efficiency low. It makes small scale agriculture really unprofitable. So we're talking about 1.5 billion people who live in these small farm communities, creates instability around jobs and food security. And I mean, it's crazy. $90 billion every year of food just isn't even picked up. So visibility is would be my number one answer.
Excellent. And maybe to sort of pull a little bit more on that, because I see there's a banner behind you about a certain company. Can you tell us a little bit about what that company is and what it does?
Sure. We have a startup called Agromobile, which is actually beyond the startup stage at this stage. We're up and running in Colombia and in the process of expanding into Africa and the United States. We're a match, batch, and pay platform that allows farmers to put goods up on the platform, be seen by potential buyers, and then take the deals that they consummate, push them to an optimization engine, which allows for pickup in an optimized way, optimized routes by trucks that want to go and pick up 1, 2, 3, 4 small loads to get those loads efficiently into the supply chain.
Excellent. And I look forward to circling back a little bit more about if you can give us some additional proof points, because that sounds quite compelling and it sounds like something that's needed. You mentioned the markets you're already in, but it sounds like we're needing this probably in more places around the world too.
And it's very exciting. It's really going very nicely.
Excellent. Thank you. And I'd now like to turn to who is now, I guess, a de facto Atlantic Council alumni. Daniela, you've been with us before talking about global food systems. You have an expertise that looks at it both from a food side and a trade side. What do you see as both the biggest challenge, but also the biggest opportunity when it comes to fixing disruptions to the global food system?
So thank you very much, David. And it's a pleasure to see you and be with our distinguished panelists here. I think that we have plenty of challenges. And so I'm not going to name all of them, but I will name a few that are in my top. Andy mentioned food waste, and I completely agree. Challenge number one, we have 950 million people in the globe right now that are suffering from food challenges and food security. And why is that, you would ask? And I think that there are two reasons. Number one, there's a certain lack of empathy. And with that goes a certain, I would say, superiority that many people feel that that's not their problem and that's those people. And we need to first address that. The second thing is the agriculture industry is huge. In the United States alone, agriculture employs about 22 million people in agriculture and agricultural related fields. And if you go to a place like China, it's exponentially more. And I mention that because agriculture, farm to fork, is comprised of many different businesses. It's difficult to have a seamless strategy all along the way to ensure that people are getting the food supply that they need and to fix that, and different interests. The third thing, and I actually think this may be the most important thing, is science. We often talk about data. In the food industry, there's no lack of data. Everyone eats. There's a ton of data. Part of the problem is how we use that data. And what I'm seeing increasingly is misinformation and disinformation campaign, and I'll be very specific about that. In a world where we have 950 million people suffering from food shortages, we have many countries that won't even approve the use, for example, of GMOs that could help them resolve these issues because of disinformation surrounding the use of food technology. So those are some of my top issues and concerns. As far as opportunities, and I don't want to go over my time, I think there are always opportunities, but in order to get a hold of those opportunities and harness them, we first must embrace what the actual challenges are.
Very well said, and definitely look forward to unpacking that a little bit more with you. I liked how you said we have to recognize we cannot say this is somebody else's problem. We have to seize it on and recognize it's all of us, and that could easily be any one of us that's going hungry in the world, and we have to address that. So thank you, Daniela. You did set the stage up well for another Atlantic Council alumni that's been with us in the past. Serging, you're an expert on countering both misinformation, disinformation. In fact, we're honored you're able to join us for the beginning of this, because I know later on you're going to need to put on your superhero cape to actually tackle some of the misinformation, disinformation surrounding COVID-19. With that said, on a global food system question, what are your thoughts about what are the biggest challenges as well as opportunities?
Oh boy, I've got a list. But for me, one of the biggest problems is monopolies. It's concentration of power. So I watch small farmers be subsumed into large organizations. There are issues with things like sterile seeds, which again is a concentration of power in the seed suppliers. Issues of concentration of crops, monocrops, potato famine all over again potentially. And that's the issue. The opportunity is to move back towards a smaller scale of farming. So instead of having giant farming, giant conglomerates, looking at how your food can come more regionally. I'm not saying literally the farm next door, but maybe the farm in the same state. And I think data helps you do that, because you have carriers for being able to see what's around you. Like I can see my local farmers market online. I can find my local farms and buy from those. That might be a privileged Westerner view, but it would be good to break some of that that monopoly. I think it hurts people.
Excellent, and I think that'll tie in well when we circle back with what Andrew is also doing with his efforts there about how we can be more decentralized and be more regional in nature. So thank you for that, SJ. Derry, you've also, we're definitely assembling the best of Atlantic Council here, so I'm glad you're able to join us, because I know you are an expert when it comes to thinking about data and AI and actually making it real and making it actually happen. So what would be your lens when you think about the global food system? SJ did talk about data. In terms of both the challenges as well as the opportunities here.
Sure. And I think one of the things that has happened in the past that I was reminded of when I first started my career, the challenge that we identified earlier with regard to that Andrew just brought up, is probably one of the biggest challenges there is. There's no lack of data. There are sensors everywhere. I think John Deere is trying to push every IoT sensor every which way, and we have data. It's the challenge of getting access to that data, right? Just because a small farmer can see that there's data doesn't mean they have a way to publish that data. Doesn't mean that somebody else has a means to also to communicate and consume that data or process that information in a meaningful way. So having the ability to do that in a cohesive manner that's useful and getting that information in the hands of the users is a critical challenge that we're facing right now. Because when you're talking to the folks, let's use Africa, if you're in an area where you don't have internet or you have spotty internet, you're going to face even more challenges here. So I think it's the access to that information, not just and how do you process and get it to them, combined with obviously the other things they just mentioned. I think the opportunities here is finding more unique ways and utilizing our existing combination. I think this is not a problem that's going to be solved by just a policy or by a government stepping in or by a private. I think it's a healthy combination of all three, where you have an opportunity for right now in this environment for all three to get together so that we eliminate, in the United States, the food deserts we have, because we are in the United States and we shouldn't have them. And then you factor that into how do we help those in other countries as well achieve those activities.
Well said, and thank you for that, Darian. I like how you've emphasized that we're increasingly on a planet that's going in terms of more and more sensors. One of the things I'm fond of noting is in 2 years or less, there'll be at least 10 times as many network devices on the planet as there are humans. But the question is, how are we using those to make sense of the world that we're instrumenting, especially when it comes? And I see that, Daniela, you have a rejoinder. So with that, I'll give it to Daniela, then Andrew, and then SJ.
I do want to make what I consider a very important point, and piggybacking on what Sarah Jane was talking about. And I have perhaps a little bit more of a nuanced view of this. If we're looking at a world with 7.5 billion people, and by 2050, it's 10 billion people, and we have limited resources, we're already using up all of our arable land. We need to get more out of the land that we have. I understand her point very well about large-scale farming. I also think that we're not even meeting our requirements that we have right now. So before we consider tearing down large agriculture, perhaps we need to think about uplifting smaller agriculture, providing them with the tools and even playing field. But even with the food deserts, the lay of the land for agriculture is very complex. For example, you might say, nearby me, you live in Ohio, there are tons of farmland, and but none of them are producing edible agriculture. And moreover, they're exporting feed, for example, to China. But that might be a very important part of the business model where it's making them economically viable. So we have to be very careful, I would say, about making blanketed comments. And this, Sarah Jane didn't do this, by the way, at all. But I just want to, for our viewers, be a little discerning about how we're going to approach big agriculture in the future.
Excellent. And real quick, before I jump to Andrew on that, maybe sort of, you talked about how we could both uplift smaller farms, but are there things that maybe larger companies could do to help sort of engage the smaller farms? And so it really is sort of like maybe a partnership possibility or things like that. Do you have thoughts on that, Daniela, about what we could do to sort of recognize that we're all in this together?
Well, I think the thing about larger scale farms is they're larger scale because they've been successful in what they do. So they know something about how this works and how to employ technology. And so very often they are the leaders. And what I have found with many of the large scale farms with whom I've worked, they actually are helping out the small scale farms. When there is, for example, an environmental disaster, they have the equipment, they're able to help the small scale farms. And I think we just need to do more as far as, we need to lift up the small scale farms, but we also need to do more with large scale farms to drive innovation and technology.
Well said. Andrew, and then I'll jump to SJ. Andrew, you had a rejoinder as well?
Right. So let's go into this issue of data, because data is really, really important. And Derry is absolutely right. There is a fair amount of data, but it is being captured in a very, very uneven way in most instances in the global north, right? So we have a lot of data about the global north. We don't have a lot of data necessarily about farming in the global south. When we started off our work in Eastern Colombia, a lot of the roads that people use to pick up goods aren't even on Google Maps. And so we're really talking about, and that's just one piece of it. We don't know where products are. We don't know how to get to them necessarily very efficiently. We're not signaling the marketplace, not just what is ready for pickup today, but what may be ready for pickup in 3 to 4 months, so that we can start to plan much more efficiently. We're not looping transport together so that things are picked up in a most efficient way. And we're not gathering the data about the routes so that we make sure that the infrastructure is adequate to the task. We're not getting things, filling up every truck so that 80-90% of the trucks that go out to the countryside to pick up goods go out empty. So there's the possibility, one of the things that we're working on with Agromobile is the idea of a full out, full back system, such that people in the rural areas can order things that they need and can bring their goods back. Imagine if Amazon were not only to drop off the things that you ordered that you didn't need, but also were to pick up things from your home office that you wanted to put in the marketplace. I think that that's really, really important. It's better for the environment, quicker and fresher to market, which is much more important. And there's cost savings for whether it's the supermarket chains or for the end consumer. Those are hugely important things. The other thing about it is that I think we tend to look at small farming as being this other. And we really need to start to look at it in exactly the opposite way. They're part of our supply chain, and they are themselves demanders of goods. We need to think of them as consumers as well as producers. And I think that there is a kind of a tension between large and small, but the biggest tension is not between large farmers and small farmers. The biggest tension really is between small farmers and intermediaries who are doing a lot of the capturing of the value around the world. I talked about the $90 billion that wasn't even being picked up. Somewhere between 210 and $260 billion of goods of value for small farmers. This is just in the global south, and it exists in the United States global north as well. But just in the global south, say $260 billion every single year of value is captured by the intermediaries and not by the small farmers themselves. That makes the whole system less viable economically. It puts pressure on rural communities. And we need the data to show that in fact goods are available. How to make those matches happen. That's the efficiency gain that's going to lower prices for people in the cities and going to raise the economic value. Right now, if I am a farmer, average age of a farmer in the United States is 58. Similar to Colombia, similar to Uganda, they're telling their children, don't go into this business. It's not a good business. And they're telling them what is now true. And we can change that.
Wow. And that is very scary if they're telling their children not to go into farming, because at the end of the day,
literally hundreds of times.
Wow. So SJ, I saw you nodding your head when some comments were being made. So I'd be interested in your thoughts.
So basically, my original comment wasn't against big farms. It was against big players. It's about the power imbalances. It's about a system that is set up for big players, not smaller players. So a lot of this discussion is about how do we move from these big monoliths to this is a system of lots of different size players. How do we make this fair across these? How does this all work? And I totally agree with that. And again, you need to have those data. You need to have those systems that support that. You need to get between those users, suppliers. You need to work out how to do direct supply. And I'm not going to back down on things like sterile seeds being a bad thing. We also need to talk about things like which crops are grown. So we have things like very water-intensive crops. We have things like very personnel-intensive crops on large scales. So what is efficient and sensible at each scale? What is efficient and sensible country to country? Should part of the system be about encouraging more local food use as well as more local food production? It's an entire system. Sorry, I'm ranting about systems. I'll stop.
No, this is great. I mean, we're getting into the real crux of the issue, is that this is a system, and I think we're hearing it's and I think Andrew hit the nail on the head, which is it's not just that farmers produce, they also receive. And so it really is this web of small players, big players, and things such as that. Derry, I know you've done a lot of AI implementations, and so thinking about what everyone's been saying here, talking about both the data but also the AI in terms of some challenges, and also making data available or accessible to others. If you were to sort of ask one or two key questions of different stakeholders to help guide them thinking through an AI effort to make this more of a balanced system or address some of the issues, what would you, given your lens on AI and data, be wanting to sort of have people be thinking about, or the questions they should be considering?
I think that's one with the assumption that we have all the data that's available to us. So let's, with that assumption, the data that is available and meaningful, which is two critical factors here. I think we all are aware of that, because I can create the best model that on the worst data and get us actually in a completely different direction. So I think the path here is: are you gathering the right and asking the right question? And are you looking only in an inward-facing way that would bias your thought process? Meaning, have you asked and requested a non-biased view into your thought process? Meaning, get someone outside of your industry, get someone outside of your bubble to actually work with you on the conversation to look at the different, to look at the new, to look at the better. Because sometimes we have that confirmation bias that we create. When we ask a question and we seek an answer, we unfortunately sometimes seek the answer that we created in the first place. And so what we must strive to do is take the data that, Andrew's gathering some awesome data that there's, there's data, that we can grab from different sensors. But what I would like for folks to start doing and try to start doing is involving both the large and the small farming industry, as well as the suppliers in the process along the way, because you have a huge logistical nightmare, right? And as this goes back to something I did, like I said, 20 something years ago, where we didn't have the internet the way it is today. And we created a website to actually help some farmers work on this. And then we realized quickly the challenge with that. Well, that was a luxury to have. And unfortunately, that's still a luxury today. So how are you going to work with that logistical challenges of getting that information back and forth so that you can create a model to determine where is the food shortages, who is producing the best crops in the particular environments and when it should be done. And as was stated, where should it go? Meaning, should I produce something that's being used in China so that we can actually get the products back from them for something else that they're going to need to create, right? Because if that's better from a global supply perspective and it makes sense, then we should look at that as a better option. And also doesn't mean that we eliminate the local, because in the kind of the situation, the global pandemic situation, we've looked at the supply chain disruptions that can create, right? And let's factor the next pandemic, that we have to look at. So we have to factor in these disruptions into the models that you create. What happens when, not what happens if, but what happens when another pandemic happens, right? We shouldn't assume that it won't happen again. The question is when and the severity of it, and start to plan your models to do that.
Very well said on risk modeling. And I'm going to circle to SJ before you have to don your superhero cape. You were ahead of, you did analyses that were ahead of the UN World Food Program in terms of the challenges that we're going to be facing with food. And we know we're facing challenges with food. So if you were to advise the G20, and if they came to you and said, what should we do, given that we know there's going to be food shortages locally and possibly even globally, given how COVID-19 is playing out, what would be your recommendations for actions that the G20 should take?
Well, they're going to have to make some very hard decisions very quickly. So where are the food stocks? Who's prepared to share? Who is producing what? Which crops are you prepared to drop in order to produce more food crops? Do you have to do that? Will you have to do that? I absolutely love my coffee, cold dead hands and all. But if it means that somebody's going to survive through another pandemic because there were food crops growing instead of the coffee, does it have to go that far? Start having those hard conversations, and if it doesn't, great. But if it does, have those conversations before you start planting stuff. Work out the logistics of the massive changes, literally massive changes to think about. As Daniela said, 10 billion people, and we get a global shock. We don't have much before we're in crisis.
Right. And I know you dive both on this, and Daniela alluded to this, and then I'm going to jump to Andrew. But SJ, before you leave us, Daniela also talked about there are some misinformation and things out there surrounding food. And given your expertise in tackling this as well, SJ, could you talk a little bit about maybe like a framework that could be applied to address this, or what would you recommend if folks wanted to tackle the misinformation, disinformation? What should they do about that?
So misinformation, disinformation exists as part of an information ecosystem. So you need to have a healthy ecosystem. Again, I'm going to keep saying the word because that's what it is. So it thrives where there are fracture points. It thrives where are things called information voids. So if you have a space there where there is no good information out there, there is not good, clear information, then disinformation is going to come in. It's a really easy fracture point. It thrives where people are under stress. So you will need to deal with the underlying factors that make it easy to inject. In terms of handling the disinformation itself, once it's actually happening, there's a whole set of processes. So we've worked hard on frameworks and mappings, right from how do you deal with the motivations for disinformation, which is like power, money, geopolitics, attention, through to, okay, now it's hit the population, how do you make the population more resilient to it? It's, again, more ecosystems, more work, always more work.
Always more work, and appreciate everything you do. You are truly a positive change agent, and thank you for that, SJ. Andrew, you had some additional thoughts on this.
Right. So I completely agree with a lot of the things that SJ is saying. I mean, I started off with the rule of holes, right? You know the rule of holes. If you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. And one of the things that we have seen through our work on agromobile is just that. Okay, we're starting off with anywhere, you look at FAO, go back and forth, anywhere between 14 and 30% of all goods that are harvested never make it to market. Okay, so first rule of holes, get that stuff to market. If we've got a growing population, we're going to be 10 billion people, we need to increase the amount of food that's in the marketplace. It's not just enough to increase yield on my hectare, right? That yield has got to be profitably put into the marketplace so that people can consume it. Otherwise, it doesn't exist, right? So rule number one, stop digging, get that stuff to market. Rule number two, make it easier for people who are doing the producing to realize value. Right? A lot of our policies and the structure, and this is something we've seen as a result of COVID. It's not just in the emerging markets world. It's increasingly obvious in the United States as well. We're incredibly centralized, right? We have a small number of points of failure. So what do we have? We want to make it possible for people to realize value, possible for people to be seen, and also to create a much more resilient system that allows for me to have coffee because I have coffee coming from multiple different sources, right? Nice. Not just from one source. If Starbucks goes under, I shouldn't run out of coffee. Right. So with nothing negative about Starbucks, but the general idea is that if we have a multi-point system that allows for more actors to be sustainably, part of it, then we're gonna see a much better system all in all. It's gonna serve more people too. We're looking now with some work that we're doing through Ernst & Young at the U.S. system, and there are all kinds of opportunities. Whether you're looking at trying to make the farmers market system work better or trying to connect in with the healthcare system, managed care organizations, things along those lines, that's untapped value, but we're not looking at it right now. And we need to be if we're going to try to not just up the amount of goods, but get them to people.
Excellent. And what I liked about it is that you recognize that we need to design for anti-fragility. And
absolutely.
So that we should aim for. Daniela, I saw you had a rejoinder, so I'll let you add to that. And then I actually have a question for you as well.
I'm so super excited by this conversation, and I have to refrain at times. And everyone is making excellent comments. And Derry, I'm just wondering if you have a trade background, because some of the stuff you said is very perceptive, and as well as Andy points out how complicated this is. Two things. Number one, and this relates to what it is that we do, we first have to accept and make a decision that we're going to feed the entire planet. That's the first decision that we need to make, and say, no, not 83%, but everyone is going to get food. Now, Sarah Jane said something that I think was really, really critical. And let's think this through. And it's about how we use our land and what we tell people to do with our land. She mentioned the issue of water, which I think is spot on, very critical. Let's look at what happened a few years ago when we had in California water shortages. What does California export? A lot of agriculture. What is their top export to Europe? Half of our agricultural exports are tree nuts, requiring a lot of water, and it was fodder for a lot of discussion. So are we going to tell the tree nut industry, no, you can't do that anymore? And it's a profitable industry, not just for them and individuals, but for the United States. So this gives you a sense of how complicated it is, because we're not just dealing with misinformation, disinformation, science, global trade, what we plant, but telling people what to do with their land and incentivizing them. Can we build a program that incentivizes them to use that land for that purpose?
So you were actually going exactly where I was going to go with the question, which is, we've been talking about the technical solutions here, but let's go up to the balcony, because clearly some of these technical solutions haven't happened yet, and we must assume there must be a reason why, which gets to geopolitics. And so you gave us one example, Daniela, but if you were being asked to be prime minister or president for the day, or advise the G20 on how do they get through. There you go, president. Okay.
Running for office.
Voting for you.
You heard it first on the Atlantic Council. So if you were to think through, how would you advise someone to begin to sort of tackle the complexities of the geopolitics? How would you bring people together to the table to make that happen?
Well, thank you for your nomination, first of all. I think the first thing is understanding how complex it is and not jumping to conclusions. And that sounds very basic, but we really, really need to educate ourselves. And Andy made some very important points, which is there's no one size fits all. A lot of the issues that he's talking about are the critical issues in some of these developing countries, but each country has a different system. If you look in India, for example, you have a lot of small scale farmers. You go to Taiwan, you have plots of land in between two roads that look like my front stoop, that big, but they have a rice paddy there. And so agriculture is different everywhere. There's no one size fits all. And we need to start at a small scale, implementing technology and specifically to the circumstances. And so you ask about G20, UN. I think it's very difficult for them to do anything other than say, we're going to make this a priority. We are going to feed the world. Everyone should be paying attention to this. We can incentivize them. We can even put together a compendium of how you can do it, best practices, which I think would be a great idea for them to do. I do want to say, when it comes to intergovernmental organizations, you've heard me before complain about them, but the truth is, if we take a pause for a second, they've done a lot of really good work. But the world has changed, and they need to change a couple of practices. And the one thing they need to change is be less bureaucratic and more open to many ideas, including those of industries and who have actually done this work as to what is successful.
Very well said, and it's near and dear to my heart that the expectation that there are going to be more and more turbulent environments, not just from pandemics, but other things going into the future, and that's a perfect recipe for one must adapt and change with it. Otherwise, one usually goes extinct. And so I like that quite a lot, Daniela. Andrew, you had a rejoinder, and then I'm going to go to Derry with the question.
Sure. So I completely agree with Daniela. I think, though, that we also, as part of our calculus, need to think not just top down, but also bottom up. The source of data, when it comes down to it, is coming from the cell phone, right? It's individual farmers who are going to connect into markets, or connect into each other, right? And to their governments and directly. And so we're going to have much more data, but that data is going to come from the bottom up, not just from a study that comes from Rome or Geneva or Washington. And I think that's going to need to be a change. We need to value their knowledge. We need to be capturing their knowledge, what they're learning, because the resiliency point is actually at the, I think at closer to the bottom. That's also where a lot of the money is trapped, right? The other thing about it is that we do have a lot of systems that are pretty ossified, that encourage intermediaries. They encourage this huge agglomeration for the simplification of ordering. And consumers have said, we like to order more things that are produced locally. And producers have said, we'd like to make it easier to connect in with our communities and make sure that they get fed. So I think that there's this idea that we can go bottom up and top down. The two are not mutually exclusive. We need to know more from the top to make good policy decisions. We need to be listening more actively and capturing more data from the bottom. There's where a lot of the value, the untapped value, I think, is.
Empowering the edge. And I like what you said about recognizing that's where the data ultimately comes from, is actually those individuals are doing it through the phone. So Derry, that actually, Andrew's point sort of builds on where I was going to ask is, you've also had experiences working both with the federal government, but also state governments on data and AI activities. And there's politics there too. It's not just food, there's politics with data. what would be your recommendations that would help people guide through sort of making sure they're being respectful of how the data is collected, that it's not a surveillance state, that it is actually sort of empowering all the different data stakeholders with an effort?
Yeah, I think Daniela, I think you said it best in there's a dual-sided part to this, in that intergovernmental and governments do have a role to play in this, and they have helped. And my statement here is, in general, lead and get out of the way. Lead, set up the framework, and then get out of the way, because what we end up having is an example of a 1.5-year process to fill out one piece of paperwork for something I'm doing here, and what is actually something that I physically can go do in about 10 seconds. But 1.5 years later, through process and policy and governance, you kind of lost along the way what you were doing, and you forgot why you asked for it in the first place. So, when I get that email this morning, 1.5 years later, that doesn't really help me. And I guarantee you it doesn't help any of the farmers, the producers, or the consumers. So hence the reason my statement, lead and get out of the way. Set the stage, set the construct for it, and stop blocking it. Right? Let's allow what needs to happen. Put the constraints in place so that we have the guardrails, so we don't we don't create things and do wrong things with the data, because we don't need a governmental institution looking at and monitoring everyone's every bit of information, right? And that's not what we want, and I don't think anyone is even going to think about proposing that. But if you have every governmental agency in there, they're all going to want to know how to capitalize that in one way or another. Not saying for negative, they may want to use it for other purposes. And I think that's where we have to work with government agencies to say, sometimes it's okay for the greater good to just set the construct and walk away.
Very well said. And Andrew, I'm going to circle back to you on what Derry just said. In your interactions with different farmers and different stakeholders, can you give us some concrete sort of where they said this has just made it so much easier, or this has removed this barrier? Can you give us some concrete examples of where they have found that what you're doing, empowering the edge, has been so tremendously successful for them?
Sure. I mean, if you think about it, in the catchment areas that we've just been piloting in recently, somewhere between 40 and 60% of all of the value of the crops is captured by intermediaries. Crops that leave my farm may change hands 3, 4, 5 times. They roll up into a centralized place from which people who actually sell to you and me in the city would have to go and buy. Those are sometimes those central catchment points are sometimes not so transparently operated, right? So what happens? Is that I'm the farmer and I get 30% of the value, 20% of the value, and that's if I'm on the main road and can easily get to market. But if you're talking about a post-conflict area, you're talking about an indigenous area, an underserved area, it becomes even less. And one of the things that we have to make the connection between agriculture as a large employer, but also between agriculture as a stability force in our world, right? There is a whole huge piece of this that is related to post-conflict. Colombia is coming successfully out of a period of long conflict. But if I am a farmer and I can't get my goods to market, right, is my agriculture viable? And then what does that do to my economic prospects of what I need to do for my family? So the huge piece of this is all about taking out the pieces of it, doing some disintermediating, or making whatever intermediation needs to happen super efficient, make there more competition between intermediaries. Whatever it is to give the farmer more value, to create stability in the social infrastructure of the agricultural areas, because ultimately they're who's going to be feeding us. And we know from many examples around the world that if there is no peace in the countryside, there's not going to be any peace in the city, right?
Right.
And so we've got an interesting experience with COVID, because COVID has. They talk oftentimes about how difficult it is to push new technology into a rural setting, into an agricultural setting, and that is certainly true. COVID has changed things a lot. And in February, we introduced a no-cost COVID-friendly light version of our platform that just allows for the match, that allows the sellers to put things up on the platform, the buyers to look at them, and for them to talk and consummate deals. Why is that important? That's important because we know that we want social distancing in the ag supply chain now, and we're going to want it later. And then as time goes on, we'll make it, we will introduce additional functionality to make it more profitable and things like that. But this is something that's not going away, making it possible for people to disintermediate and to connect with the market. That's the number one thing. People don't go into agriculture to make more stuff. They go into agriculture to make money. And that's rational.
That's very rational. And I really appreciate everything that you're sharing there. And those are some very tangible examples of, like you said, removing the intermediaries so that they can actually, the farmers themselves can have more value in terms of what they're producing. All right, we're going to take a slight pivot here now because we've got some time left. We've got about 18 minutes left, and I'd be interested in folks' thoughts. Let's say a large institutional investor wanted to actually do a project that was actually focusing on making farms more resilient to disruption, empowering farmers, but also thinking about, we talked a little bit how this can also help the climate, and this can help make things more ecologically stable and things like that. And maybe I'll go first to Daniela, and then Andrew, and then Derry. But be interested in your thoughts about if an institutional investor, whether it was an actual foundation, or if let's say it was actually a billionaire that actually said, I want to make a difference here in the world, and I recognize this is a big issue. How would they address? And I know, Daniela, you've had a little bit of thoughts, and maybe sort of I could lean in a little bit. You've had some thoughts where maybe if a country said they wanted to guarantee that food could be provided to them from another source or something like that, how would you recommend they think about that, and how would you advise that institutional investor?
Well, it's interesting because Andy made a point which I think is also very important, this bottom-up approach, and you need both, right? You need a top-down approach, and you also need a bottom-up. And to his point, if someone says, hey, I don't have this, but I do have this technology, can I use it somehow? Can I get good data from it? So if I were a billionaire and I said, how am I going to start approaching it? I would start through pilot programs, top down and bottom up.
Nice.
When you're talking about environmental issues or preservation of land, preservation of species, that's a little bit of, that's a very lofty goal, and it's something that's totally achievable, but you would really want to look at a large scale farm to try that out because it's a bit of a luxury, right? So I would start there, but at the same time, I would also be investing from the bottom up in small scale farms to also understand that it's a very different business model. It's like comparing, I do construction versus I run a restaurant, totally different businesses. Right. And we like to think as food is food, but it really isn't. So you really have to do both.
Excellent. And I liked how you said about that. It is about both. And it's about, like you said, recognizing completely different business models, have a strategy, but learn from doing at the edge case as well with the bottoms up approach. So Andrew,
and we do need to put this into a compendium so we can start learning from our experiments.
Excellent. And recognizing, and I think that's very well said, is that that we don't have lessons incurred. We actually want to have lessons learned. And all too often we don't actually learn from the things that we do. So Andrew, let's say a institution or billionaire approached you and wanted to do an effort. What would you advise them on?
Oh boy, we would love that. So if you have any billionaires who are friends who are interested,
there may be some that later watch this video. I don't know.
We are raising money right now, and it's going great. So yes, by all means, come our way. We are ready for you. So the three pieces of our platform are the place to start, right? Making the match so that you make it efficiently and frankly safely, and then batching things together. One of our big supporters has been the Toyota Mobility Foundation. They're super interested in, think about it. They're super interested in fuel efficiency. They're super interested in the fact that the fleets that go and pick up most goods around the world, whether you're in Africa or Latin America or Asia, most of them are 25, 30, 35-year-old trucks, right? They're terribly polluting. They're not even allowed into some major Colombian cities. So there are opportunities to upgrade and to improve, which brings to the third piece, which is about payment. And part of payment is who has access to credit. if you are at the end of the road and you are invisible to the market, right? You do not have a credit score. You do not, you're not a user of financial services products. Then you're also missing out. I mean, go back to Hernando de Soto, but you can, there are all kinds of examples where a little bit more data about your transaction history, about your capabilities would make you eligible for financial services goods, which would in turn allow you to think longer term, invest in more plant and equipment and upgrading your production. And it all creates a virtuous circle that gets us toward more sustainability, better kind of sustainability, so less environmental drag, the ability for more women to be participants in the process, because right now almost the entire supply chain is held by men, right? Most of the transporters are men, a lot of the buyers are men. So again, a lot of these things, they all touch together. We want to grab those together. The other thing about it is we're looking at adding new functionality to the platform to create a higher level of engagement in between transactions. And why is that important? Because a lot of the upskilling is done still face-to-face by ag extension agents that have to get in trucks and run around the countryside to try to make farmers better farmers, right? Well, okay, that's great. But you know that a lot of what you get is in the repetition of something and the ability to create a community to help you to build the next level. And so there are tremendous opportunities. We're working with a credit union called Contrasan in Eastern Colombia, who've been fantastic supporters of ours, and they see this as a way of reaching more customers discreetly, without actually going and sitting at their kitchen tables in the time of COVID, and we got this chance to grab passive data that is generated by the transactions themselves, which in turn can inform the whole ecosystem, make it more just, make it more efficient. I mean, that's ultimately the way to go.
Well, that very compelling, and I think there's a lot there that could be compelling as an initiative to do. What I particularly liked about what you were saying, Andrew, is thinking about how this can actually make it more just and make farming more just. Because, like you said, access to credit, the fact that it's actually is right now underrepresented by women. These are huge issues that we need to do that have been systemic issues for a while, even before COVID-19, but there may be actually opportunities to now address this.
And I'm very serious. Send us your billionaires. Seriously.
All right.
We are ready. Okay.
We will definitely circulate wherever we can.
Thank you.
You made a very compelling case. So Derry, you get to add to Andrew's case, and what would you recommend for a institutional or investor that was thinking about AI being applied to this, or a billionaire that would want to think about how they could actually, I think Andrew already gave a great example about the data associated with credit, but what more would you think about as well in that pitch?
I think, what we don't want to do is constrain. We're looking at this as a global problem, right? So it's not just a localized situation here from a United States perspective, right? Because if we're talking just United States, and I say one thing, it would only really. So I think one of the big challenges, if you're looking at AI and data and investments, you're looking at infrastructure. Right? Your investments are in the infrastructure side, period. If I don't have internet, I don't have the right infrastructure. If I don't have access to being able to get the right sensors in the right place or the right time, or the compute resources, then it also doesn't matter. You need to bring that stuff locally. Now, it doesn't mean that every farm has to have this massive compute facility or anything like that, but it's giving them access to that information. And the only way to just do that is you can't just say, hey, congratulations, here's a phone. They're going to look and go, great, so when am I going to get access to cell technology that's going to allow me the bandwidth issues, right? So if you want to invest, you've got to invest in the infrastructure, and that is the bottom line. Number one thing you have to do in order to make this work. Once you get past that issue, then you can invest with the right set of scientists, and I think there are no shortages of really smart people, some of them right here on this panel, to be able to address some of the issues here, where you can bring in and the data scientists, et cetera, to the table to work with the subject matter experts to kind of understand what's going on. But I think you got to have that first underlying investments being made, and combined by the way, with some policies and laws that might have to be changed,
Right.
because some places may allow the use of drones, some places may not. Some places may allow the use of that data to be correlated, and some places may not. For example, the GDPR, how does that affect gathering information on one farm versus another? Right. And you have not saying that it necessarily affects it one way or another, but we don't know what the unintended consequences are when you start to compile that data at a higher level. So you have to look at relaxing certain restrictions when it comes to the basic humanity needs of first we shall eat, and getting those challenges out of the way.
Very well said, and I'm already thinking about when you're talking about that you need to invest in the infrastructure, and that's needed to make the connectivity. Of course, I'm thinking we know about Project Loon. We also know that both Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are thinking about putting satellite constellations up there, and so it may very well be creative ways of providing the connectivity necessary to make sure
Mhm.
the data is available to inform the edge and also inform the larger efforts to make farming able to support, as you said, feeding everyone on the planet, not just a percentage of the planet. So now we're at the final sort of lightning round with, again, the idea that we were talking about here, which is this is about feeding everyone. And so I'm going to ask each of you for about three tweet links action steps that would be takeaways from what we just discussed here. I'll go Derry, Daniela, and then Andrew, you had the final rejoinder. But Laura, sort of thinking about if you were to sort of what can the public do, what can we each do and take away from this conversation? What might be 2 to 3 tweet length answers that you would recommend? So Derry, you get to kick us off with the lightning round.
Sure, and I think I'll continue that statement I just made with which is invest in the infrastructure, right, and work with the locals in the infrastructure side. As far as what we can do, I think it's continuing to do things like what Andrew's doing here, but it's also providing that information, making those tools available to the scientists necessary to expand upon that. Right. So from our side, that's something we can do. And then from the governmental and private sector side, investing in those unique ways of getting access.
Excellent. And I'll add also as an additional one, using moderator's privilege with what you said earlier about lead and then get out of the way. I think that's also a very key one. It's almost sort of like the Peace Corps model of work yourself out of a job, is recognize that we've got to empower people as opposed to necessarily always being there. So thank you, Derry. That was really great insights. Daniela, your turn for the lightning round.
I love something that Derry said about technology, and as I'm thinking about this, and also what Andy said, my final comment is on social justice. It's feed everyone gets food, and everyone gets technology, because this gives them access to success. Without these two things, they cannot be successful.
Very well said. And I think this is a very good framing of why this matters and why it's not just about making the food supply more resilient to shocks, but it's also recognizing that there are injustices, both historical and present, that we have to address. So thank you for that, Daniela. And then Andrew, you get to be the closer for the lightning round with your
Right. Well, thanks.
tweets.
That's an honor. So I got involved in this effort about 3.5 years ago. Because I saw the same issue everywhere around the world. Small farmers sitting by the side of the road with a big bag of stuff. This is a problem that needs to be solved. I have 2 kids, 8 and 10. If we're going to eat, we need to solve this problem, right? So we need to put power in the hands of the small farmer and make it worth their while. We need the big organizations, whether they be big buyers or big producers, to look to small farmers as an ally and as a customer. And we need to learn about the small farm ecosystem and apply that learning. We can't take it and we can't look at it as apart from us any longer. This is core to our success, maybe core to our survival, and let's get to it.
Excellent. And like you said, this is something that we all have to address as core to our survival as a species, as a planet. And let's get to it. So with that said, I want to thank each of you for being great panelists and everything that you do as positive change agents to address these really challenging issues. And thank all our audience for watching. We look forward to another conversation in the future with the Geotech Center. Take care.
Bye-bye.